that. So I think, with respect, Mr. Chairman, unless we deal with the issue of power, we cannot talk of developing this country forward. When the power was reliable, and it was cheap, and it was available, Kenya was a powerhouse for manufacturing. The whole of Eastern Africa was dependent on Kenya. Today, our manufacturing is gone. It's not only contracting. There's an exodus over the last 10, 15 years by many companies. People have moved to where the cost of production is cheaper. Because cost of production is the main thing. You can't compete. If my water is going to be, every time we're thinking of manufacturing, you are thinking of how much is it going to cost. Will I be able to sell? So that is the challenge. And energy is one of the largest, the main component. Plus, of course, the many regulatory and other challenges that we have. So I think, Mr. Chairman, let me leave it, and then we'll deal with questions in the interest of time. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Please.
You said you're going to comment on the G2G. You need to understand that.
Oh, yes. I was, once upon a time, as the chairman said, was in petroleum. I left 5 years ago. But let me say this, and I think the CS has said it. The open tender system that we had was very efficient. In fact, it was so efficient, it has been copied by other companies. What they do, the ministry was doing, was very commendable. They aggregate the total demand for fuel, for example, for next month from the market. If it is 100 million liters of diesel, then they would tender. The ministry would do an open tender, very transparent, and then the companies would, because it's the mean average price in Dubai. Plus, of course, the only thing you quote for is the premium. And because of that competitiveness, we were getting I can tell you for a fact, I don't know of a time when we have ever paid more than $40. In all my life, I was in petroleum. $40 per cubic meter for the premium. It's always 10, sometimes even negative. Some of the big companies, because they source, for many of their chains in other countries, they were even giving negative. I do remember one time. Then we go to G2G. G2G. I have written about it, and I have said this is a crooked deal. We go from $20 to $40 to $100 premium. We were told it will be cheaper. It is not cheaper. We were told it will help on the dollar. It has not helped on the dollar. Find out the day this thing was announced, what the dollar rate was and what the dollar rate is today. We're buying in our industries at 156, average the whole of last week. So it has not helped. It has not helped. Look at what the president of Uganda announced yesterday. He said they've gone into their own. One of the places we are making money as petroleum companies in Kenya is the export to South Sudan and Uganda and Rwanda and those countries. And you get that one in dollars. The transit portion is in dollars, and people are making, that is where you get the dollars, as the CS said, which is true. But today, if Uganda decides to go that route, which they announced, then obviously it will not only impact on the business aspect and the economy in terms of what we were, all those companies and businesses who are doing that, but also it will impact on the G2G deal itself. That and we were told theirs is even cheaper. I don't know the details, but I'm sure CS knows. But I think it's part of the tweaking that we are doing on policies that is causing all this, which I mentioned earlier, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Abraham.
Thank you.
If you can be as quick as Bill was.
Yeah, I will. First of all, thank you. Thank you so much to this committee for.
Just a lot. Now put on your mic. Put on your mic now.
Good now?
Yeah.
Thank you. So it's really a pleasure to come and join us fellow Kenyans as we discuss these matters which are really of concern. I work in a space where we have also spent a lot of time thinking about this and speaking and presenting. And one of the questions I asked myself when I got the letter was, what more should I say? Because we have said to Parliament, but this provides an opportunity to be able to speak. I will not repeat the matters that Bilo has spoken to, but let me bring us to attention that as we speak right now, according to the statistics we have of 2021, 22 million Kenyans are below the poverty line. And therefore, when we say this, we basically, and that could have changed. In the last 2 years, a lot has changed. Incomes have not increased, if anything, and I have shared in the paper that I've presented. The incomes are actually on a negative growth. And therefore, we are not talking about some utopian institution out there. We are talking of real people. We are talking of Kenyans spread across this republic who cannot put food on the table, who now, because of the cost of the high cost of living, have to choose between medical care and school fees. And you would wonder, so should they worry about medical care now, or should they worry about the future of their children and their education and the like? And therefore, I needed to present that number. That 22 million number is an important number because then it puts a face, it puts a life of somebody in this conversation. And then the slow growth of incomes. I will not talk about so much about the cost of living because that will be the core of what I present. But one of the biggest challenges where we are is that incomes have not changed in the last couple of years. If anything, during the COVID period, and I was just looking at the budget speech that the CS read, earlier this year, there are very few Kenyans who are earning, even be above the figures that we basically increase the taxes. I think it was about 1.1%. So you have a very huge population for who earn much more, but even the incomes have not changed. And the report I'm looking at here is basically by 2021, we are on a negative 6% in terms of decline in incomes. I will not say so much about the dollar, but the dollar has a compounding effect. And therefore, let me speak to the things that we think are critical for us to think about. Public debt and debt servicing has been presented by Bilo, and I'm sure the CS will also speak. The question of in-year deficits, in other words, how deficits grow within the year, is a matter of concern. Mr. Chair, if I was just to just present and say that every year our deficit within the year has increased, say for 2021, 2022, 2022, 2023, where we had a negative 16% and a negative 5%. 2014, 2015, we had a 99% increase in deficit from 367 billion to 732 billion. The year we are talking about, 2022, 2023, 2024, this current financial year, as per the supplementary budget published last week but one, we already have a 20% increase in the deficit from 720 to 864 billion. Unless we rein in the deficit problem, we will still continue to run with a public debt problem that we are unable to manage. And this is important because when you look at the trend, these are changes that happen within the year. Mr. Chairman, if our revenues are not performing, why should our expenditures increase? Why don't we rationalize our expenditures? I want to confirm to this honorable team that I don't think we have a revenue problem. Every year our revenues have been growing year on year, an average of 10%. We have a spending problem. And somebody who is struggling with Fuliza, Tala, branch does not need more money. Needs a behavior change. And therefore it is important for us to rein in. Because what we are doing is that we are borrowing more and more and more. But where are we borrowing from? When you look at our debt currently, it's at about 50% each in terms of domestic to external. The debt servicing that we are paying, just one step behind, that whereas our debt is big, our biggest risk exposure is within the domestic market. Mr. Chair and co-chairs, I think this is a matter that we are not having a conversation on. This year alone, we expect to raise a revenue of about 2.5 trillion Kenya shillings. Let me bring it down. We expect to raise about 250 shillings in ordinary revenue. Our consolidated fund services, which includes pensions and constitutional expenditure, is 278, 200 shillings. I'm just using average, it's 2.078 trillion. Out of that, our debt repayment is 1.86 trillion, 186. So do the math. 250 minus the 200, which these are non-discretionary expenditure. So they basically, it's a must pay. It's a must spend. Of that 180, 100 is to the domestic market. Now, why is the domestic market important? It is because a lot of that borrowing has been on double digit. 12%, I think the last coupon I saw was at about 15%. In other words, we are highly at risk because with all that money being held by government, what it has done is that government basically is competing with private sector, with private individuals in the domestic credit market. That is important because when you read the story of what has happened in Greece, in Argentina, recently in Ghana, then it is the domestic market, the famous haircuts, were taken in the domestic market. But why is it important? If you have only, and if you add appropriations in aid, it's another 400 billion. So basically 290 shillings in my simplified figure. What you're saying is that teachers alone will cost you 400 billion. In other words, if you just add teachers' salaries to the consolidated fund services, all the money in ordinary revenue is gone. You've not even paid for military costs. You have not done transfers to devolution. And therefore, I want to suggest to this honorable committee that we have a debt crisis. And it is important that for us to have part of this national dialogue is perhaps to start having a conversation on how do we restructure. I'm avoiding the word default. How do we manage ourselves out of this situation because we do not have money to provide public services? And we have tried to analyze, because when you look at expenditure in social services, you look at expenditure to county governments in terms of the transfers we are making to county governments, everything is on 0%. It's only debt servicing that is on a higher upward trend. We have a crisis. And the earlier we accept we are in a crisis, they say the first step, after denial is acceptance. We need to accept that that is where we are. Because if we don't have this conversation, and there's interesting, the former Greek minister of Greece for finance in Greece has written an interesting paper, and he said one of the biggest problems is that they kept denying that there was a problem until finally, in fact, the paper is called The Denial of the Greek Debt Problem. We cannot continue to say that we are sustainable. We are not sustainable. If we are to provide, something we'll have to give, and it's either public services or how we organize. I think I've executed that matter to the best, because as long as public services will suffer, otherwise we have to borrow more, because this deficit that we have now increased to 864 billion. Where do we expect to get the money from? We have to borrow more. High taxation. As a result of the kind of situation we have where the space, the fiscal space we have is limited, you then have to raise taxes. But who are you raising these taxes from, I beg to ask? Including the housing levy, which I still don't understand the concept. And I consider myself among the Kenyans who read public documents, perhaps more voraciously. And I still don't understand why you are taking more money from people for a concept. 80% of Kenyans, and this is the only thing I'll say on housing, live in their own homes. Have you asked them the kind of housing they need? I rest it there. High taxation, therefore, because of the situation we find ourselves in, the only option left is to raise more taxes. And when you raise more taxes, the group that you are targeting is only two kinds of individuals or legal persons. Is a corporate institution, a business entity, a premise that is registered, and that is providing a public service. Providing a good to the public, and therefore they purchase it, or an incomed citizen. That income citizen also has to pay taxes in terms of VAT, because income even includes a person who gets 100 shillings, in terms of in terms of their daily. And therefore, when we are thinking about taxes, would it be time to actually rethink the speed at which we are introducing taxes in a context where even the business environment is shrinking and incomes are not necessarily growing? I think here is a pacing question. And what do we introduce? Can you introduce all these taxes at the same time? But let me speak to the one on energy, because that is a critical one. Here, you have diesel that, of course, drives a lot of the IPPs in terms of energy, and I really thank Mr. Chirchir here, because he's really explained quite well. But that diesel already had been charged a tax, so almost one could argue, are we going through a situation of double taxation? But when you look at the taxes, and we did outline, just in the pump, and the EPRA has really provided. You have excise duty, you have road maintenance levy, you have petroleum development levy, you have petroleum regulatory levy, you have railway development levy, you have anti-adulteration levy, merchant shipping levy, import declaration fee, and value-added tax. And when you work out those numbers, you find that out of the 217, for instance, you will pay at the pump, 80 shillings of that is taxes. Wouldn't this be the best place, for instance, to say, given the situation we are in currently, can we pause? Can we give a rebate? Well, because why should the cost always be transferred to the consumer? Can it be the other way around? To say, can we give a pause to some of these taxes because of the state? Because we are talking about cost of living. Now, all this is compounded in the fact that in October, from the statistics again we have, 13% transport, there was a 13% increase in transport costs in terms of inflation. So that tells you that 13% in terms of increase, in transport.
Need it, get it, eat it. Uber Eats.
I want to present that if we are going to manage the cost of government and the cost of living right now, we have to make a decision on what to do with state-owned enterprises. 25 to 28%, and I'm using that figure because we are to confirm for now, is of MDA's expenditure is by state corporations. Those state corporations, the last count we have made, they are at about 248 of them. These are not the 48 county governments, neither are they the 22 ministries at the national level. These are institutions, some doing duplicate work in different ministries, 25%. Now, this, when you go to the budget, is also the space where we don't have very much transparency about what goes on. We only find figures when there is need for a bailout for Kenya Airways. I'm giving an example because it's the one, for instance, in the supplementary first budget here has an increase of 1.7 billion in guaranteed debt to Kenya Airways. It's in the books. And during the review, the stock risk exposure, according to the BPS 2023, during the review period 2022-2023, the stock of risk exposure is estimated at 2.7 trillion, where 2.66 trillion is from state-owned enterprises. This is from the National Treasury report. So in other words, you are stuck with many structures that give you the highest risk with the least transparency. If you ask me, Mr. Chair, co-chairs, I think if we are going to deal with the cost of living, let us action on matters of how do we manage debt moving forward, including dealing with the deficits. Let us make a very decisive decision. What do we do with taxation that has to do with fuel, because that is being translated to every part of the economy. And let us action. There is a whole report on merging, selling state-owned enterprises. In fact, I think PBO and Bwana Masinde is here, did an estimate that if you were to sell, if you were to privatize some of them, I think will make about 30 billion annually. I rest my case. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now give him the floor to tell us whether he plans to do something about them. And this is the beauty of this engagement and this dialogue, is that you have an opportunity to say what you have said to other institutions. Bilo has been very well heard in the media, and now he can be heard by Kenyans, and the CS can hear him, both CS National Treasury and Energy. So, Professor.
Thank you very much, members and the co-chairs and everybody else who is listening. It's actually a very informative debate, which actually can push me even to ask questions. But I would make sure that I don't do that. The DNA in me will be suppressed. The DNA in me is that I'm a teacher. So I would suppress that, Your Excellency. You already are familiar with that. But I wanted to find out, I want advice from you, Your Excellency, co-chair, and Bwana Kimani Ichung'wah, the co-chair. Should I first of all comment on what has gone through, or should I first of all do I had some written submission on the 3 areas that I was asked to talk about. But they also interlinked with some of the issues that have come up.
I think the best, my view, Kimani may have a different view, is you please make your presentation.
Okay.
And then after that, comment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Without necessarily repeating what has already been said.
Okay. I think the statement I started with was on the cost of living and also related issues to that. And what I did was to prepare some responses that would actually try to explain where we are. Because I think, I'm sorry to say that sometimes when we find ourselves in a problem, we start thinking that that problem has just emerged. It has been there. It is the problem that we failed to arrest the problem that we find ourselves in the same problem. So, in fact, when I looked at this, I said, yes, it is important for us to look at the cost of living. But also, we have to also ask ourselves, how is it computed? How does it come about? Why are we beaten twice by this problem? And it has come up several other times. So in this presentation, I want to look at the cost of living. I want to look at the implications of the Finance Act 2023. I also want to look at the implications of what has come so severally on the removal of any taxes, levies, and charges to cushion Kenyans against high cost of living and their attendant cost to the economy. Let me start off with the cost of living. Honorable Chair, co-chairs, let me start by defining the cost of living. And this is the amount of money that people need to spend in order to buy the basic goods or services such as foods, clothes, and payment for, especially and even in terms of where they live. I think Abraham has used that as trying to define who is below the poverty line. But the poverty line is actually composed of a survival kit, so it could be different, but it's something that we can come back to. And the cost of living is often used to compare how prices of goods and services have changed over time, over a period of time, and given the area, or in a given area, but more importantly, how expensive is it computed, or is it shown in terms of to live in a particular area versus another. That's why you find that we have a basket of goods that are measured every month, and every 3 months there's a survey for different cities in the country, and 3 different categories of people: higher, medium, and low income basket of goods. So it's computed as an average of that. But what are the factors that drive the cost of living? First is to understand that the cost of living is actually measured through the Consumer Price Index, and it is reported every month by the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics. And the cost of living, the Consumer Price Index is actually used to measure inflation by tracking the changes of the prices by the consumers in the targeted basket of goods and services over time. Inside that basket, there are tradable goods. Inside that basket, there are non-tradable goods. I'll come back to that to try and explain what is happening in the 2 categories of tradable goods and the non-tradable goods. They have different effects, especially when it comes to nominal exchange rate movements. And even before I leave that, the non-tradable goods will drive the real exchange rate, while the tradable prices will mimic the exchange rate movements. Honorable Co-Chairs, as you may be aware, inflation rate has remained above the government range of 5.25, let's say 5% and 2% radius or dimension from both sides. That is 7.5% and 2.5%. That range, above that range means, especially a high, it means that inflation is high. It's in a regime of high inflation. And this is from June 2022 to June 2023. And that means that you can actually argue that the cost of living was high during that period. The policy range is well percent on the other side. And we do believe that when it is below the 2.5%, we believe that it's deflation. And when it's above, it's high inflation, above 7.5%. And this is mainly as a result of commodity prices, especially food and fuel. And this has come due to multiple shocks. And so many people have talked about those multiple shocks. The biggest problem of shocks is that, especially from the supply side, is that we don't have solutions from the supply side. You have to bring back the supplies. But if you don't have the supplies, then you also have to take measures to bring to reduce the price level. And those measures sometimes, or most of the times when it's purely supply side effects, they induce the economy into a recession. And you can imagine a combination of recession and inflation is what we used to call it stagflation. Let me give you an example. If food prices are rising because there is no food, the only solution is to bring food into the market. Otherwise, prices will continue rising. If you're constrained by using the demand side tool, that is, you tighten monetary policy, what you are doing is that you are actually trying to dislodge the plateau of high prices in future, but otherwise you have not solved the scarcity value problem. So we have a scarcity problem. And we have so many people have repeated the crisis we have gone through. It's a layer of multiple crises. In fact, what I actually argue that you have crises that are persistent. Most of the time we believe that crises will be short-term. They will peter out. But these are persistent. It means that they create a permanent effect or a structural effect. And you have seen that in, especially during the COVID time, the Ukrainian crisis, the ravaging drought, all these are persistent shocks. And so they create a heavy impact in terms of food scarcity and the scarcity value rises. But of course, at the end of the day, when we thought we had gone through this, then obviously there was tightening monetary policy in the advanced economies. For many years, we thought that the quantitative easing would be prolonged. But of course, we are paying the price that heavy liquidity in the market since or after the global financial crisis, we are paying for this. And that's why you find that the US continue to tighten monetary policy. In fact, even now, as of 2 days ago, we were discussing and everybody argued, and including in the US Secretary to the Treasury, told us about 3 weeks ago that their core inflation is still high. If core inflation is still high, it means that their interest structure will continue to be high. Ours is not core inflation, which is high. Ours is the inflation that is coming from food and fuel effects, which is transmitted to us because we are importing a lot of food. There's a scarcity value. Fuel prices are rising. And of course, it's also exacerbated by the nominal exchange rate movements because domestic traded prices will mimic the movements in the exchange rate. Now, we rely very much on the imported fuel, so it means that there is very little we can do about that. It's only try to innovate around it. And of course, I've listened to some comments about the G2G. I think my colleague here will come back to say most of the African countries are asking us, how are you doing it? Because you have managed to actually run away from the two effects that we were salvaging ourselves. One of them is because of the dollar depreciation effect. Initially, we have said that it is coming from the US effect, but I'm going to argue later to show that we are paying for the past policy mistakes. Let's not hide. Somebody said, we are Kenyans, we live in Kenya. We should own up the mistakes so that we don't repeat them again. So the biggest impact right now on the nominal exchange rate is actually our own past mistake. But because my colleague here may come back to talk about the G2G, it is, if we continued without the G2G, it would not have worked. Things could have been quite devastating. Uganda, as just my friend Bero has mentioned, they are trying to run what we are doing because they think they can do it better, but there are so many headwinds. Tanzania was coming to run from us. They couldn't manage because one of the things is that the domestic market must be efficient. We have a domestic market in terms of fuel and even palm prices that is efficient. What we wanted to support it is, how do you source the dollars? Can we have a deferred LC? Trade finance is risk-free. We argued for other people, even including by IMF, for about 6 months about how trade finance works. It's risk-free. We have to move to situations where we have to go into structured finance for us to be innovative to solve ourselves from the current crisis, current problems that we are facing. Now, what policy mistakes have contributed to this outcome of high cost of living? Mr. Co-chairs, the rising cost of living in the country is also as a result of an ineffective and also inadequate policy intervention that resulted in aggravating the already dire situation. And some of these interventions include subsidizing consumption of goods instead of production to respond to the rising costs of living. And fuel subsidies alone itself was so heavy, it was not very sustainable. And we do agree. It has nothing to do with the political positioning here. It is a whole issue of seeing what is the magnitude and where could we have gone with it. And this was because the consumption basket of fuel for the people, actually, one of the realities is that we were not subsidizing the poor by fuel subsidies. We were actually subsidizing everybody else, but not the poor. And this is because in the consumption basket, if you open it up, you'll see that the fuel for people at the bottom of the pyramid is marginal compared to those to the middle and upper income groups. The second subsidy was on maize flour, and the whole issue is who benefited, because only a few benefited because only a few manufacturers were able to access the market through using that subsidized maize flour. So many things have been written on this, but the most important thing is that it did not reach out. Now, investments in enhancing agricultural productivity are hampered by gaps in food supply chain. that contribute to import dependency and even post-harvest losses. And this is a point that Biro Keros mentioned, that I'm a person who is fond of market. This is where market failure has actually pushed us the wrong way. When markets don't function, in a sense, what you're really saying is that production will fail downstream. So it is no magic, because you are not going to produce if the market is not going to give you the returns. It is no magic also that if you cannot appropriate returns from your own investment, then you cannot invest. That's why we have a secular decline of the manufacturing sector. What Hinga is trying to do here is, why he's saying we need interventions, and one of the interventions is housing. For us to revive the manufacturing sector, let's be Kenyans, let's accept our mistakes. There is no way you're going to find people producing food if you cannot sell the food. You cannot sell maize, you cannot sell your rice, you cannot produce. When markets are functioning, then you know that upstream, downstream, you increase production and productivity. Then, when you are there, and Kenyans, we are known for smallholder production. Upstream, you're observing higher incomes. That gate, that bridge that we have destroyed, that somebody has captured the market, then it means that you cannot produce food at the appropriate time. And I remember, Your Excellency, remember our discussion on production, processing and transportation. That will facilitate storage. There's nothing with the current technology that we cannot store. So essentially, we could have benefiting from other periods that we could have done very well. Kenya, like many other countries, are also experiencing foreign exchange challenges due to the rise in US interest rates. And this is compounded by misaligned exchange rate and the adoption of managed exchange rate system. In the last 6 years, we have actually said, actually in the last 7 years, so we can actually say the system led to a collapse of the interbank, because you want to manage the two-way exchange and restrict how much it can. Then in the process, the interbank collapsed. Now, at the same time, Your Excellencies, let me say also, the government was heavily investing in infrastructure projects and other mega projects, even expressway. What is the effect? The effect of that investment is actually to bid the prices of non-tradable prices up. Okay? The non-tradable prices starts rising because of that heavy investment. Because of that, if you wanted to compute the real exchange rate, because we need to look at real figures here, it is the reciprocal of the non-tradable prices. But that is too complex. Let me reduce it a little. If the non-tradable prices are reflecting the real exchange rate, what should happen is that the nominal exchange rate must move to equilibrate the situation. Otherwise, the whole economy will be under disequilibrium. That is why the nominal exchange rate is the automatic stabilizer. I emphasized this in 2010, 2011. I think my friend here, he remembers, Mheshimiwa, you remember that I argued that don't control the nominal exchange rate because it's the automatic stabilizer. It's the nationwide relative price. So the moment we control that, then it means that the non-tradable prices will push misalignment. Even the IMF and the World Bank mentioned some years back that the exchange rate was misaligned. That's also what the governor of the central bank a few weeks back actually said. It's a statement of fact that that was true. So what has happened? It is the process of adjustment. Then the automatic stabilizer must move so that it equilibrates the whole thing. We are paying for past mistakes. And that is where we are. So, because we created a distortion, that distortion can only be corrected by movement of the relative price. And that means that we reprice so many things, we suffer. We suffer because even the nominal debt is actually ballooned because of the pure effect. In fact, our computation with some of the people who are showing me some data, they were showing that actually, even if you didn't borrow a cent, our external debt would have increased by 24%. Just imagine that sheer impact. Of course, we cannot now, we have to do a lot of work to disentangle what happened because of the US or the developed world tightening their monetary policy and rising interest rates, and what happens to the others. But we can even show some numbers. For example, the current supplementary one shows that the deficit has increased by almost 0.9%. 0.9%. This is purely interest rate cost on debt. And that's why we have moved from our target 4.2% of GDP to about...
That would be how much in absolute figures?
It's about 145 billion. 145 billion shillings, absolute figure.
That 0.9 or 9%?
0.9.
0.9.
0.9%.
0.9, an equivalent of 145 billion.
Yes.
On account of exchange
on account
fluctuation.
of just interest rate, the exchange rate movement and interest rate cost. You can imagine how much we are exposed. It is a policy choice that we made that we have to have a floating exchange rate, but it's also a policy choice that we make. We sustain that policy space. It's a policy that is good for everyone, but we have to make sure that we don't control it for our benefit, because in the short term, it may look nice, but in the long term, we have to pay the price.
Said you moved from 4.2 as a 5.2.
I still think that we should allow Prof.
Yeah, that's why I'm trying to continue on the topic. He said we moved from...
We have moved from about 4. It was about 4.4 to add 0.9. It's giving us like 5.4.
Okay.
We are still trying to see how much we can cut. That's why the supplementary, to make sure that we remain at 5.2% fiscal deficit. I know somebody talked about fiscal deficit, but even the example that was given by Biro Kero said we had moved to 9% in terms of deficit. Now, 9% accumulation of deficit, it means that you are working like there are no budget constraints. Abraham was talking about that. We used to model behavior, and the first thing is to say there is no Ponzi game. This in Kenya we talk about the pyramid. When we model government behavior, we start by saying there are budget constraints, no Ponzi games, because you cannot have unlimited borrowing. You have to have. But now, when we moved from about what did you say, Biro? From is it 4% to about 4.2% to about 9%, you can see that something has to give way. Anyway, I'll come back to that a little bit. Second, of course, when the real exchange rate is misaligned, it affects everything else. It affects the performance in terms of our manufacturing sector. It affects the performance of our trade sector, and you find us in current account deficit is rising. So then again, nominal exchange rate must depreciate to equilibrate the process. You find that FDI, that is foreign direct investment, is not coming into the market. In fact, I was looking at the data from 2021, 2022, it was 0. So this outcome, it implies that for the economy to return back to stability and it means that the nominal exchange rate has to adjust and it depreciates so fast. But I cannot call it a free fall. That is not a good, there is a policy. It cannot be a free fall. It is actually adjusting to the magnitude of misalignment. Fourth, we do know that we also have to tighten monetary policy because you are faced by supply side shocks and you are faced by scarcity value, and you have to mimic also what is happening to the other world, like the US. In fact, when this tightening in the US began, you realize that most of the people are caught off guard, including even the European Central Bank. They did not react until the second tightening of the US. So by the time they were tightening, Europe was tightening, the dollar was already stronger than actually the euro. So essentially, they noticed their own problems in terms of domestic inflation much earlier. Finally, there is no way in our current policy of exchange rate that domestic prices will not mimic the exchange rate movements. It also tells us that in future we cannot make those mistakes. It also means that in future we can observe our competitiveness by making sure that we do not impose controls. In fact, wherever I went, I was asked, Kenya has imposed exchange controls. I said, no, we have no capital controls and we have no exchange controls. Look, we have been looking at the data, for example, the East African currencies and Kenyan currency. And we realized that all of a sudden, other currencies started depreciating against the Kenya shilling. Why? Because there was at one time, the Kenya shilling was overruled in terms of trading. In the East, remember, it was the preferred currency at the cross-border, at the border places. But because we changed into the new designs, instead of having a seamless translation, we canceled all the MOUs with other central banks. It became a foreign currency. Nobody was trading with it. And because you cherry pick which notes should it be, nobody was sure. Traders are never sure. They never follow the newspapers. They follow instinct. So if you look at from that period, from 2018, 2019, all of a sudden, all the East African currencies are strengthening against the Kenya shilling. I am calling them policy mistakes, Your Excellencies, is because that is where we are. It's an institutional failure problem that we have to come and remember that let's reverse it. We should not heap blame on anyone, but there is an institutional failure problem. Let me go to more government measures to reduce cost of living. And the first thing is when the Kenya Kwanza government started, began the journey for bringing down the cost of living and improving livelihoods, while at the same time trying to foster sustainable, inclusive economic transformation through implementation of bottom-up economic transformation agenda, we had several issues to take up. One is to recognize that at the totality of the problems that we are facing, it's a development discourse, it's a development agenda. I heard Ibrahim saying that we should cut spending, but you cannot wake up and cut spending. Because if you needed to cut spending and to the limit where it also fits your budget, you have maybe to have the population in school, teaching or whatever, everywhere, because they are recurrent costs and we cannot just trim them at a go. We have to understand the realities. And one of them is to make sure that we have some interventions that do not require massive resources. Interventions can create a multiplier effect. One of them was the Hasra Fund. I didn't understand what my friend Biro Kero said, and said it is 300%. I borrow the Hasra Fund to make sure that my credit scores are improved. I borrow and maybe after 3 weeks I pay back, and I observe how much the pro rata in terms of how much you pay back. So I can talk about it. I borrow, I see, and want to see how much people are borrowing. In fact, we get data of who is reading in terms of how many times. In fact, we have said the next phase is we want to visit those people everywhere in Kenya and see what kind of business they are doing. This is an intervention. The housing project is an intervention because we cannot revitalize or revive our manufacturing sector without very strategic and targeted interventions. Because where we are, we have come down so hard. And I really sympathize with the situation that 22 million of Kenyans are below the poverty line. The debate is not how it is measured. The debate that's the truth. Poverty has hit us. One of my previous works that I would have started with it is to show that strong growth will reduce poverty significantly. But once it is supplemented by targeted social interventions, transfers, it is going to flatten inequality. But the whole issue is that everything that in that statement requires money, isn't it? It requires money. So let's not chase our shadows. The first thing to do, because we don't have enough money. For example, somebody talked about during the COVID, I provided a study where we did using data from phones. By the mere fact of shutdown plus targeted social transfers, we reduced our transmission rate of COVID by 9%. But we cannot continue the transfers the way we were continuing. So in a sense, everything that we want to do requires money. So that's why I'm saying strategic interventions are very, very important. Hasrafat was one of them. The housing, the affordable housing is another. There are so many that are in the pipeline. But let me focus on, special focus on how we are going to increase employment and even create a more equitable distribution of income and social security because of the availability of, for example, affordable goods, affordable houses. We are likely to increase employment in a big way, and that can create its own momentum. But at the end of the day, we are looking at our tax rate or our taxes, not because they are tax rates. We are looking at, we cannot even afford to use the tax rates to actually finance what we really have. But what we have done with my team at the Treasury and the KRA is to ask, how can we increase the tax base? At the end of the day, it's the tax base. During the Africa Climate Summit, we actually said we need to go into natural resource accounting because there are resources that are not brought to our GDP, and we can actually, again, improve on that. When Hinga was talking, I was also trying to check even our economic survey to see when you're parading the GDP data, the first component is ownership of dwellings, isn't it? That is, so increasing affordable housing, we are actually increasing the base, the GDP. All these measures are what is required in the development discourse. Mr. Chairman and co-chairs, the government has taken a long-term sustainable approach of subsidizing production of goods instead of consumption to respond to rising cost of living. And through this, for example, the voucher, the provision of fertilizer through the voucher, e-voucher fertilizer subsidy, this is extremely important, and I can give you the numbers. About 6 million bags of 50 kg bags of subsidized fertilizer were provided, worth Kenya shillings 15 billion. And they were retailing at a cost of 3,500 per bag. And this is a major reduction from the Kenya shillings, from the retail price of 6,500 per bag. So it represented a subsidy of 3,000 per bag, 3,000 shillings per bag. The most important thing is that this fertilizer was provided to specific to the regions, and that is why it has delivered a bumper harvest. And that is what we are expecting. That's why we are all fighting to make sure that the post-harvest losses are minimized this time round. The second was the guaranteed duty waiver on importation of key food products such as white maize, rice, yellow maize, soybeans. And this was, again, to add, and there are a combination of so many assorted proteins, concentrate, feed additives, that was effective from 1st February and to 6th August 2023. And this was to allow us to bridge food stocks deficit, as well as lower and stabilize food prices, and even animal feeds that were also suffering quite devastatingly. So you can imagine that those are very, very important interventions. The second intervention, co-chairs, honorable members, was the macroeconomic stability by ensuring that inflation remains within its target range. And the policy range is very, very important for us because it means that it anchors inflation expectations. And adequate monetary policy interventions were made. Inflation, for example, Monetary Policy Committee gradually raised the policy rate, the CBR, the central bank rate, from 7.50% in May 2022 to 10.50% in June 2026. And it has been retained at 10.5% in August. And consequently, we have seen inflation coming down from about 9% to about 6.7% in August, 6.8% in September. So it's flattening, and about 6.9% in October. So it is actually flattening around 6.9%. And this is from a peak of 9.6% in October 2022. And you can see that this is very, very important. If the inflation remains below 7% and stabilizes that, at that point, it means that we are going to lower or we are going to anchor expectations of higher inflation, and that is going to signal interest rates declining and stabilization of the exchange rate will be ensured, of the nominal exchange rate will be ensured. Mr. Chairman, co-chairs and honorable members, the interventions required to correct market failures, which occur due to abuse of market power, is very, very important. And information asymmetry and also negative market externalities is one of the things that we really need to look at. When Bill Okero was speaking, I actually thought about institutions, and I thought institutional failure is a major problem. He also talked about corruption. I take those two things at the same time. Because everywhere you see everybody talking about institutional failure, everybody talking about poverty and corruption, is an institutional failure problem. But we fail to look at it. We have to go back and ask ourselves, which institutions have failed us? And how do we solve it? Institutions have two key components, or maybe functions that I believe, I attribute them two functions which are very, very important. And one of them is to define and uphold the legal framework, that is, the rules of the game. And because I'm talking to majority of the lawyers here, they know exactly what the legal framework means. And the second thing is that they have to define appropriate incentives. In economics, we call them incentives, but in general, it's what we call the reward structure. A combination of rules of the game and appropriate incentives will encourage prudent behavior in the marketplace. Let's face it. When institutions fail, we suffer. When you talk about corruption, I always like dividing corruption into two components. And that is where we really need to zero in. One of them is, I used to joke about it one time. I remember the late Honorable Saitoti presented his book and talked about corruption. I actually argued that there are two forms of corruption. One of them is this bribery you see around in government offices, in traffic police and all that bribery. That is greasing efficiency. It's because we have allowed the reward structure in public service to go so low that somehow some people look at you and say, if you don't grease efficiency, I cannot be efficient. But the second one, which is more subtle, is that it is state capture. And we have to deal with it through the legal mechanism. But if you don't deal with them, they reinforce each other. Anyway, I'm not saying that we should continue with the greasing efficiency. No. I'm just saying
I was going to really get shocked coming from you.
No.
I thought you actually meant greasing inefficiency, but it's greasing efficiency. But please continue. We'll ask our question.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It is greasing efficiency, but it can be eradicated by increasing incentives. That's why I brought the issue of incentives. If the pay package is consistent with your effort, then obviously you don't need any efficiency. But the most important thing is that because of institutional failure, they reinforce each other. And that is what we really need to fight. So in a sense, we want to make sure that we create interventions. For us to move out of this, we have to create interventions. I started with the Hasra Fund. It's an intervention. G2G is an intervention. Affordable housing is an intervention. The whole issue is that you start it off, and then when it is working, you release it to the market. But for it to work, the market must be nurtured. I have three, maybe call them 4 stages in terms of making sure that we have strong markets. First, you have to develop the markets. And even where they have been devoured by so many other institutional failure problems, we have to make sure that we work very hard to develop those markets. The second one is that we have to nudge that market to the optimal path. It is not easy, it just don't happen. The third one is that we have to protect the market, because markets will not function unless they are protected. That's why we have regulations. That's why the institutions that protect the market are very, very critical. And finally, we have to regulate the market Regulating the market is reminding them that there are rules of the game. And that is what we are going to do when we make these interventions. Then we move to the next level. Interventions are creating the market. And then we move forward to solve the market failure problems. Let me give you an example. Why the house fund was very, very important. I worked very hard with some of you. Thank you very much. Working in Parliament was very good because I convinced you that we need to have CRBs, credit reference bureaus. Initially, we started sharing negative information. But I came to the relevant committees and argued that we also need to share positive information for objectivity. And they did agree. Then CRBs were created. And it was good that they have a one-stop where you can get information for everybody who is participating in the market, financial market. But then our revolution in terms of digital finance came in. And digital lenders started creating credit scores. It was very, very important because it becomes an endogenous variable that you want to protect yourself. You want someone to look at your credit scores, and you can be evaluated on your credit scores. So we can escape the collateral technology that has inhibited the growth of the markets for many years. But over time, you can agree with me that CRBs were not talking to those holding the credit scores. They were not talking to each other. CRBs became a binary tool. You are either in or out. That is, you are blacklisted, isn't it? You are blacklisted, you are out. But so it means your credit scores didn't matter. You be conscious about your credit scores, wasn't it? So you can see this is an institutional failure problem. I once wrote about it, but I will not go into it. But I argued that our digital financial system will succeed if there is no institutional failure problem. In fact, I called it state capacity must improve. So we have done so many, and I even wanted, because that's why I wanted to show you why the Hasra Fund was important. I've done so many things, but let me come to the energy. And of course, the diversification and what the CS has said is part of the game in terms of LPG. For me, that is very, very important. And again, the drought concerns. In fact, one of the things I wanted to add to the point that the CS Energy has raised is that we now have a technological breakthrough. We can actually store renewable energy. The green hydrogen is a very easier way to move, and that is what we are even moving. The world is moving into that, even the solar. And because we have a technological breakthrough, it means that we have to continue investing in this space so that we can improve on all the issues, all the storage of renewable energy, and we can solve our energy constraints as we put it. By the way, it also means that our manufacturing sector, the secular decline in our manufacturing sector, has a bearing in terms of cost of energy. In the early 290 survey every year to the farms, and most of those farms actually closed down. And most of the time, when we started that survey, they were talking about
Shikilia. Technician tafadhali angalia hii mambo vizuri. Angalia hii mambo vizuri. Ama ni aje, si ndio? Wanatokasia kabisa. So technician tafadhali hapana fanya nini? Money has been poured to finish. Yes. Naomba musiende tafadhali.
Kaini tu hapa. Wanaenda.
Haya. Wamesema nini kidogo. Yes. Tafadhali technician hakikisha hii mambo iko sawa. Alafu microphone mula kakimula no. Kimula tawinyo mamit. Tengeneza microphone pia mamit, asikie mamit.
Maber.
Microphones pia asikie mamit kama kimula kakimula no. Kimula tawinyo mamit.
Inimengeyo kama kelo niga. Mama ya.
Omera.
Inimengeyo kama kelo niga. Mama.
Omera giving any one. Yes. All right. In a very short time from now, His Excellency the Governor atakuwa na wasili hapa pamoja na His Excellency Honorable Raila Odinga atakuwa nafika hapa, na vile vile Jaduong Ker nimeambiwa amefika hapa.
Ako karibu kukuja. Tutamkaribisha officially.
Jaduong Ker ako hapa. Kama wewe ni msichana na unataka kudance Prince Inda, tafadhali wacha confidence.
Yes.
Wacha confidence yenye unajua, kama katika Biblia Musa alikuwa ametoa viatu na anaona
kama
misitu inaungua.
Misitu.
Na anatoa viatu na kanyaga moto na nini na mguu tupu.
Juu alikuwa
kama wewe ni msichana na unajua ni ndogo, tafadhali wacha confidence feature. Dance nyuma ya wenzenu. Sawa.